Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. What I'd like to talk to you about this time is various aspects of the global economy. And I'd like to start talking about what we call mature market economies and the mature market systems that they form together. First, the economies themselves generally are engaged in the notion of free trade. Free trade capitalism really is supported by the basic fundamental idea that governments should interfere as little as possible, should not have undue amounts of tariffs or other measures that interfere with commerce and business, that we avoid all the non tariff sort of barriers that governments can throw up to restrict business and to protect home industries. So, market economies are today the top players, and they're considered to be mature economies. And so, some factors they share in common are, in particular, the fact that they rely on the forces of supply and demand. Now, supply and demand means the economy will produce the products that people want and need. And the producers will supply those things that are necessary to make those products, and also that they can export themselves. So that's what mature market economies do. They're based on other notions of private ownership of business and as little government ownership of business and competition from government as possible. Um, the accumulation of personal wealth and the ability to keep the profits of your business and so forth. Um, and these market economies operate best in places in the world, countries or regions where we have well developed infrastructures, highway structures, communication structures, and networks and so forth really do matter when you want leverage in business, and particularly in the international sphere. So, some examples for you of uh, mature market economies are the United States, of course, Japan, and certainly France. Now, various countries, generally the ones, these mature market systems and those around the world, they band together uh, into trading blocs. And these are simply clusters of countries that engage in high levels of trade with each other. They have some things in common and maybe history of trading between themselves, but they make trade agreements. And they may even go so far as declare each other most favored nation, give them that special status, which in international commerce means you're probably going to give them a better deal because you do more business with them, you like them more, you have a good working relationship, and it's very beneficial to both. Um, and then just below the mature market economies and the systems and the partnerships they build are these high potential, high growth economies. And these are not necessarily the countries you would think of. Um, but the reasons they don't make it into the status of the mature market economies are that they are underdeveloped as yet. Maybe they have a weak industrial base, they don't make enough products, or maybe their infrastructure is weak, or they don't have good communication or highway systems or transport systems and so forth. Maybe their currency isn't strong or it's weak, and they have a lot of poor consumers, and so there's not a strong middle class with um, excess money to spend, disposable income, in other words. So these places often are, very high in their potential and their potential for growth and so forth, but they're struggling against a lot of challenges and factors. So some really good examples of countries in this particular classification are China. Just think about it. China is not yet considered a mature market economy. They have too many problems with the size of their country, with transportation and communication and so forth. They do not have the necessarily the stance where government doesn't compete. And in fact, government does compete. And there are many state owned businesses that outright compete on the international market. So it puts them in a little bit different classification. Also, we see India, Vietnam, Brazil, Russia, places like that, that still can develop up into a mature market economy, but for now, for a variety of reasons, maybe resource dependency or lack of resources or government type, and so forth. Then we have this notion of other economies that are out there. These sort of defy classification because of their status in the world, or the possession of some critical resources, or some kind of social political factors that are going on there that really make it hard to know what's going on. And so we would have to say certainly a place like North Korea would be a place that defies classification. They don't seem to have any natural resources. They have some coal. That's about it. Um, and certainly they're not. They're under embargoes and so forth, so they're not really trading on the international level. Um, but there are other places that I can give you as examples that are considered other economies that defy classification and are difficult places to do business. And this is the Middle East and much of Africa. And this is because of a variety of things like political instability, cultural differences, ethnic violence, and real variances in the existing infrastructure of roads and communication networks and ports and all the transportation stuff that you need to make big business work. But I'll talk more about these other economies later on. All right, here I want to talk to you a little bit about the structure of how these things work. And some of this I've mentioned and some I haven't. The mature market economies and systems, they use market factors. This is about supply and demand. And so they're based on the private ownership of business. We expect that people can get rich if they're willing to take the chance on starting businesses. And generally, this is facilitated by places and regions, countries, whatever, that have well-developed infrastructure. One of the things that really benefits these mature market economies are strong trade agreements and this clustering into groups. So we have NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement with the US, Mexico, and Canada, and it is indeed about North America. And we have the EU, which is 23 nations in Europe, the largest bulk of that entire continent, and so forth. And when we have groupings in Central America, CAFTA, I believe, in the Pacific Asian, Southeast Asia, many of these trade agreements. But for mature market economies, these are the big ones, NAFTA and the EU. Here is a nice map of the world that really shows us where these mature market systems and so forth exist. So three relatively market systems dominate the global economy. The one here in North America, and then Europe, of course, right here, and then Pacific Asia, Japan, and through here. Notice I didn't include China in that because really they are, even though on this map they're the same color here, um, they're considered underdeveloped and high potential, high growth sort of economy because of, well, look at the sheer size of the country and the varying geography and so forth. You know, they are a communist country, and that means a lot of government control of private wealth and business, although they have been experimenting, right, with capitalism for quite some time, and they have a growing middle class. So who knows where all that's going to work out. If we look at these areas here, large areas of Africa, large areas still in Asia. We look at the Middle East, and then quite a bit still of South America and even in the Central America. Really, these are underdeveloped regions. They're not necessarily the other economies, like here's North Korea and so forth. And there are other places that have their problems. But you can see where the development is. Right after World War II, the United States was in a position where they were able to dominate international trade. And they did for decades until the world advanced with the rebuilding of economies in Japan and Germany and throughout Europe and so forth. Right after the end of World War II as well, um, an international agency was formed called the GATT, which was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that really was meant to put some sort of regulation to the idea of working out problems in international trade and making it easier for countries to talk to each other about issues in trade and to provide a forum for fairness and for working out disputes. And indeed creating the first rules which many countries would join and then agree to govern their relations when it came to trade. And that's where we first got that most favored nation principle. Um, The World Trade Organization came along in 1995. It replaced the GATT entirely, and the goals were the same. They wanted to promote trade, and they wanted, in particular, countries to engage in multilateral negotiations. So here we're talking about what I was discussing with these clusters and groupings, like NAFTA in the EU and so forth. They wanted countries to approach their negotiations multilaterally, and that way work things out, many at a time instead of one on one. And they wanted to establish impartial procedures for resolving disputes in trade and so forth among all the members. Over time, of course, since 1995, the WTO has become controversial. It has great people who believe in it and want it to keep on working, and others who want to disband it. But I think overall, as an international agency goes, it's it's tried to do what its mission was, and it's done a pretty good job helping countries come together and providing a framework. Here we see some real information on it. And this is just what I was saying. So this is a recap of the details. The GATT to promote international trade by reducing barriers and generally leveling the trading field as much as possible. Most favored nation principle. And then the GATT we replaced by the here at the WTO. Use multilateral negotiations, promote trade like before, make policies that are consistent and predictable and so forth. Here we talk about the high potential or high growth in a little bit more detail, like we did with the mature market economies and so forth. Um, and what we see is that these are the problems I've been talking about. They might have a weak infrastructure where they simply don't have a good highways, and of course, then they don't have a well-developed transportation industry of trucking companies or delivery companies or rail or whatever it takes to move products and freight within any given area. So they might have a weak industrial base, so they don't produce much themselves. They don't make a lot of products if their industrial base is weak. And if that happens, then their GDP is probably not real strong. They're not building up a strong middle class through providing, good skilled jobs and so forth. They might have to deal with inflation all the time and have very poor currency and so forth. And so in general, their consumers are poor. And so again, those same examples I gave you, China, India, Vietnam, Brazil, and Russia. Although for certain, we have to say China has a burgeoning middle class, and there are millionaires and wealthy individuals now in China. India, the same thing. The vast bulk of 1.4 billion people are utterly impoverished, but there are, you know, some people who are getting rich. There is a small middle class growing there, and Vietnam has become a industrial powerhouse with their manufacturing capability and their trade relations. And in fact, with all these trade disputes with China that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, Vietnam has emerged as a place where people are taking their business to get the same sorts of things that they were getting from China. Um, there's lots of challenges here for these economies. First of all, they don't have a lot of wealthy or even consumers that have some disposable income. So you need personal wealth if you're going to have a society. It's going to have a high level of trade going on, where products are imported and exported, and so forth, that people get what they want. The infrastructures are underdeveloped, so they don't support big business operations, and it means it takes a long time to grow and expand. Um, you're not building experience in your local business people and your acumen and so forth. You're unfamiliar with working at the levels that most of the world is working at, and you're not participating in all those mechanisms. Um, and so that means you have to spend a lot of capital to upgrade for economic development and so forth. And so a lot of projects in places like this would be devoted to economic recovery and development of economic strength. And that's where your money would have to go. You're not going to innovate in new products. You're going to try and build a base of some type so you can have a strong economy. That takes money and it takes time. And then, of course, maybe the government isn't right for a free market, mature market economy type of system. If government interferes, if government thinks they can do business better than private individuals, then often their enterprises are quite inefficient. They're not competitive in the world market. And it makes the currency weak and people don't want to invest there. So these are all challenges and so forth, and things that we see that high potential, high growth economies have to undergo. And they may not have to face every one of these challenges, but one or two of them might be enough where it's going to take them some time to have the same leverage as the mature market economies. And then, of course, those other economies that we've been talking about, um, they really do defy classification. Um, Most of the time, it's not that they have possession of some particular resource, it's most of the time that they don't have any. And it's usually a political or cultural situation. So, right now, we would consider them poor business risks. And we just have to be careful. The biggest problems that we have to deal with would be the political instability, the possibility of violence, the possibility that your operations could be attacked or destroyed. And political instability also means that you could have your investments seized by the government if it came to that, if there was revolution or a coup or something. And they would nationalize their industries, they would seize your operations. And they may decide to pay you something based on whatever they determine the value was, but likely, and in most instances, that doesn't happen. You've just lost your huge investment. And these places, some of them have really difficult cultural challenges and differences that you would have to overcome. And they may have a hostile sort of attitude to doing business or changing the status quo and so forth. And then again, in any place that has ethnic violence and strife, um, it's a poor business risk. It's not a place that you want to invest and so forth. So generally, we don't want those sorts of situations in business. And the less government interference, according to, where the way we look at business in America, the better. Okay, folks, that's all I want to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.